Warmest greetings to all my incredible subscribers and new viewers alike. Welcome, friends, to our video dedicated to Lycidas. Let's dive right in and uncover its wonders. Lycidas is a poem by John Milton, written in 1637 as a pastoral elegy. It first appeared in a 1638 collection of elegies, Justa Edouardo King Naufrago, dedicated to the memory of Edward King, a friend of Milton at Cambridge who drowned when his ship sank in the Irish Sea off the coast of Wales in August 1637. The poem is 193 lines in length and is irregularly rhymed. Many of the other poems in the compilation are in Greek and Latin, but Lycidas is one of the poems written in English. Milton republished the poem in 1645. In the next segment, we'll be exploring history of the name Lycidas and its implications for our subject matter. Herodotus in his book X written in the 5th century BC mentions an Athenian counselor in Salamis, a man named Lycidas, who proposed to his fellow citizens that they submit to a compromise offered by their enemy, Persian King Xerxes I, with whom they were at war. Suspected of collusion with the enemy for suggesting the compromise, Lycidas was stoned to death by those in the council, and those outside were so enraged. With all the uproar in Salamis over Lycidas, the Athenian woman soon found out what had happened, whereupon, without a word from the men, they got together, and, each one urging on her neighbor and taking her along with the crowd, flocked to Lycidas' house and stoned his wife and children. The name later occurs in Thucydides's Idylls, where Lycidas is most prominently a poet Gothard encountered on the trip of Idle-by. The name appears several times in Virgil and is a typically Doric shepherd's name, appropriate for the pastoral mode. A Lycidas appears in Ovid's Metamorphose as a centaur. Lycidas also occurs in Lucan's Pharsalia, wherein a sailor named Lycidas is ripped by an iron hook from the deck of a ship. As we progress through this video, let's now turn our gaze towards Lycidas as pastoral elegy. By naming Edward King Lycidas, Milton follows the tradition of memorializing a loved one through pastoral poetry, a practice that may be traced from ancient Greek Sicily through Roman culture and into the Christian Middle Ages and early Renaissance. Milton describes King as selfless, even though he was of the clergy, a statement both bold and, at the time, controversial among lay people. Through allegory, the speaker accuses God of unjustly punishing the young, selfless king, whose premature death ended a career that would have unfolded in stark contrast to the majority of the ministers and bishops of the Church of England, whom the speaker condemns as depraved, materialistic, and selfish. Authors and poets in the Renaissance used the pastoral mode in order to represent an ideal of life in a simple, raw landscape. Literary critics have emphasized the artificial character of pastoral nature. The pastoral was in its very origin a sort of toy, literature of make-believe. Milton himself recognized the pastoral as one of the natural modes of literary expression, employing it throughout Lycidas in order to achieve a strange juxtaposition between death and the remembrance of a loved one. The poem itself begins with a pastoral image of laurels and myrtles, symbols of poetic fame. As the berries are not yet ripe, the poet is not yet ready to take up his pen. However, the speaker is so filled with sorrow for the death of Lycidas that he finally begins to write an elegy. Yet the untimely death of young Lycidas requires equally untimely verses from the poet. Invoking the muses of poetic inspiration, the shepherd poet takes up the task, partly, he says, in hope that his own death will not go unlamented. The speaker continues by recalling the life of the young shepherds together in the pastures of Cambridge. Milton uses the pastoral idiom to allegorize experiences he and King shared as fellow students at Christ's College, Cambridge. The university is represented as the self-same hill upon which the speaker and Lycidas were nursed. Their studies are likened to the shepherd's work of drive afield and battening flocks. Classmates are rough suitors and fawns with cloven heel, and the dramatic and comedic pastimes they pursued are rural ditties tempered to throat and flute. A Cambridge professor is old Damotus loved to hear our song. The poet then notes the heavy change suffered by nature now that Lycidas is going a pathetic fallacy in which the willows, hazel groves, woods, and caves lament Lycidas' death. In the next section of the poem, the shepherd poet reflects that thoughts of how Lycidas might have been saved are futile, turning from lamenting Lycidas' death to lamenting the futility of all human labor. This section is followed by an interruption in the swain's monologue by the voice of Phoebus, the sun god. An image drawn out of the mythology of classical Roman poetry replies that fame is not mortal but eternal, witnessed by Jove God himself on Judgment Day. At the end of the poem, King Lycidas appears as a resurrected figure, being delivered, through the resurrecting power of Christ, by the waters that led to his death. Burnished by the sun's rays at dawn, King resplendently ascends heavenward to his eternal reward. Although on its surface Lycidas reads like a straightforward pastoral elegy, a closer reading reveals its complexity. Lycidas has been called probably the most perfect piece of pure literature in existence. Patterns of structure, prosody, and imagery to maintain a dynamic coherence. The syntax of the poem is full of impertinent auxiliary assertions that contribute valuably to the experience of the poem. The piece itself is remarkably dynamic, enabling many different styles and patterns to overlap, so that the loose ends of any one pattern disappear into the interweavings of the others. Lycidas also has its detractors, including 18th literary critic and polymath Samuel Johnson, who infamously called the pastoral form easy, vulgar, and therefore disgusting, and said of Milton's elegy, "It is not to be considered as the effusion of real passion, for passion runs not after remote allusions and obscure opinions. Passion plucks no berries from the myrtle and ivy, nor calls upon Orpheus and Mincius, nor tells of rough satyrs and fawns with cloven heel. Where there is leisure for fiction there is little grief." Johnson was reacting to what he saw as the irrelevance of the pastoral idiom in Milton's age and his own, and to its ineffectiveness at conveying genuine emotion. Johnson said that conventional pastoral images, for instance, the representation of the speaker and the deceased as shepherds, are long ago exhausted, and so improbable that they always fork dissatisfaction on the mind. Johnson also criticized the blending of Christian and pagan images and themes in Lycidas, which he saw as the poem's grosser fault. He said Lycidas positions the trifling fictions of heathen deities Jove and Phoebus, Neptune and Aulus alongside the most awful and sacred truths, such as ought never to be polluted with such irreverent combinations. Johnson concluded, "Surely no man could have fancied that he read Lycidas with pleasure had he not known its author." In this chapter, we'll be unraveling the enigma of the uncouth swain and discovering its transformative power. Though commonly considered to be a monody, Lycidas in fact features two distinct voices, the first of which belongs to the uncouth swain or shepherd. The work opens with the swain, who finds himself grieving for the death of his friend, Lycidas, in an idyllic pastoral world. In his article entitled Belief and Disbelief in Lycidas, Lawrence W. Hyman states that the swain is experiencing a loss of faith in a world order that allows death to strike a young man. Similarly, Lawrence Schott asserts that the swain is projecting his grief upon the classical images of the pastoral setting at this point in the elegy. Throughout the poem, the swain uses both Christian and pagan concepts, and mentally locates Lycidas' body in both settings, according to Russell Fraser. Examples of this are the mention of death as an animate being, the sisters of the sacred well, Orpheus, the blind fury that struck Lycidas down, and the scene in which Lycidas is imagined to have become a regional deity, a genius of the shore after drowning. Since Lycidas, like King, drowned, there is no body to be found, and the absence of the corpse is of great concern to the swain. Ultimately, the swain's grief and loss of faith are conquered by a belief in immortality. Many scholars have pointed out that there is very little logical basis within the poem for this conclusion, but that a reasonable process is not necessary for Lycidas to be effective. Fraser will argue that Milton's voice intrudes briefly upon the swains to tell a crowd of fellow swains that Lycidas is not in fact dead. Here one sees belief in immortality. This knowledge is inconsistent with the speaker's uncouth character. In the upcoming section, we'll be shining a light on the pilot. Upon entering the poem at line 109, The voice of the pilot of the Galilean lake, generally believed to represent Street Peter, serves as a judge, condemning the multitude of unworthy members found among the clergy of the Church of England. Similarly, Street Peter fills the position of Old Testament prophet when he speaks of the clergy's moral decay and the grave consequences of their leadership. He then compares these immoral church leaders to wolves among sheep and warns of the two-handed engine. According to East, South, De Beer, this two-handed engine is thought to be a powerful weapon and an allusion to a portion of the book of Zechariah. Concerning Street Peter's role as a prophet, the term is meant in the biblical sense, De Beer claims, and not in the more modern sense of the word. Since biblical prophets more often served as God's messengers than as seers, De Beer states that Milton was not attempting to foretell the likely future of the church via Street Peter. De Beer continues on to note that Street Peter's appearance in Lycidas is likely unrelated to his position as head of the Roman Catholic Church. Neither was Street Peter ascribed any particular position within the Church of England. Instead, De Beer argues that Street Peter appears simply as an apostolic authority, through whom Milton might express his frustration with unworthy members of the English clergy. Fraser also agrees that Street Peter, indeed, serves as a vehicle for Milton's voice to enter the poem. The church was so thrown off by the poem that they banned it for nearly 20 years after Milton's death. In this part of the video, we'll be diving deep into the conclusion and unraveling its profound impact. Several interpretations of the ending have been proposed. Jonathan Post claims the poem ends with a sort of retrospective picture of the poet having sung the poem into being. According to critic Lauren Choate, Lycidas is transcendently leaving the earth, becoming immortal, rising from the pastoral plane in which he is too involved or tangled from the objects that made him. She claims that he is diffused into, and animates, the last location of his corpse of his experience of body as object, neither fully immanent since his body is lost nor fully transcendent since he remains on earth. With an ambiguous ending, the poem does not just end with a death, but instead, it just begins. The melody clearly ends with a death and an absolute end, but also moves forward and comes full circle because it takes a look back at the pastoral world left behind, making the ambivalence of the end a mixture of creation and destruction. Nonetheless, thy large recompense also has a double meaning. As Paul Alpers states, Lycidas' gratitude in heaven is a payment for his loss. The word thy is both an object and mediator of large recompense. Thus, the meaning also maintains the literal meaning, which is that of a sacred higher being or the pagan genius. The final lines of the poem. And now the sun had stretched out all the hills, and now was dropped into the western bay. At last he rose, and twitched his mantle blue, tomorrow to fresh woods, and pastures new, may refer to Milton's imminent departure to Italy, and they are reminiscent of the end of Virgil's 10th Eclogue. In the next phase, we'll be immersing ourselves in the realm of Justa Edouardo King Naufrago and exploring its real-world applications. Lycidas was originally published in a poetic miscellany alongside 35 other poems, elegies in the death of Edward King. Collected at Cambridge, most of the poems were written by academics at the university who were committed to the conservative church politics of Archbishop Laud. Among the poets were John Cleveland, Joseph Beaumont, and Henry Moore. Milton, on the other hand, who reported that he had been church-outed by the prelates, had failed to achieve a position at Cambridge after his graduation, and his religious views were becoming more radical. The style and form of his poem also strongly contrasts from the other texts in the collection. While most of the poetry adopts a Baroque aesthetic linked to the Laudian ceremonialism that was in vogue in the Urs, Milton wrote Lycidas in the outmoded pastoral style. Lycidas may actually be satirizing the poetic work featured throughout the Justa Edouardo King Naufrago. In the next portion, we'll be immersing ourselves in the realm of 1645 reprint and examining its broader implications. Milton republished the poem in his 1645 collection Poems of Mr. John Milton. To this version is added a brief prose preface. In this Monody, the author wails a learned friend, unfortunately drowned in his passage from Chester on the Irish seas, 1637, and by occasion foretells the ruin of our corrupted clergy, then in their height. When Milton published this version, in 1645, the Long Parliament, to which Milton held allegiance, was in power. Thus Milton could add the prophetic note in hindsight about the destruction of the corrupted clergy, the blind mouths 119 of the poem. Let's now zoom in on influence and uncover the hidden gems that lie within. The poem was exceedingly popular. It was hailed as Milton's best poem, and by some as the greatest lyrical poem in the English language. Yet it was detested for its artificiality by Samuel Johnson, who found the diction is harsh, the rhymes uncertain, and the numbers unpleasing, and complained that in this poem there is no nature, for there is no truth, there is no art, for there is nothing new. A line from the poem inspired the title and themes in Stops of Various Quills, an 1895 poetry collection by William Dean Howells. Similarly, it is from a line in Lycidas that Thomas Wolfe took the name of his novel Look Homeward, Angel. Look homeward, angel, now, and melt with ruth, and, O ye dolphins, waft the hapless youth. The title of Howard Spring's 1940 political novel Fame is the Spur takes its title from the poem, as does The Sheep Look Up by John Brunner, which is taken from line 125. The title of the short story Wash Far Away by John Berryman from the collection Freedom of the Poet is also taken from this poem. I me. Whilst the shores and sounding seas wash far away, where'er thy bones are hurled. The song The Alphabet Business Concern Homer Fadless Splendor, from the album Heaven Born and Ever Bright 1992 by Cardius, contains the lines. Comes the blind fury with the broad shears, and slits the fin-spun life. If you have any suggestions for future videos, feel free to drop them in the comments section.